Snow came down soft and steady over the ridge, the kind that muffled every sound but the crackle of the fire and the low murmur of voices drifting from the mouth of the cave. Lantern lights spilled golden across the stone entrance, catching the steam that rose in long ribbons from the pool inside, curling upward into the cold night air before vanishing into the dark. Travelers stamped snow from their boots at the wooden threshold, grateful faces pink with cold, hands outstretched toward the warmth pouring from the mountain itself. She stood near the edge of the great pool, a stack of clean linens folded over one arm, watching the water ripple where a weary rider had just stepped in to soak the ache from his shoulders. The bathhouse smelled of cedar shavings and mineral water, of stew simmering somewhere behind the stone partition, of wet wool drying near the warm rocks. It was a good smell, a living smell. 2 winters ago there had been nothing here but darkness and the distant drip of water finding its way through rock. She let her hand trail along the smooth timber railing her husband had built, worn soft now from years of travelers' palms, and for a moment the noise of the bathhouse fell away from her. She remembered the cold. Not the ordinary cold of a Wyoming winter, though that had been sharp enough to steal the breath from her lungs, but the deeper cold of having nowhere to go. She remembered standing in the ruined dooryard of a cabin that was no longer theirs, watching the first heavy snow settle over a land claim dispute that had swallowed their plans whole. Her husband's jaw tight with worry he tried to hide from her, the wagon groaning under what little they still owned. That cold had lived in her chest for days afterward, through the long search across white ridgelines, through nights spent shivering under canvas while the wind screamed through the pines. She remembered thinking, foolishly, that perhaps this land did not want them. And then she remembered the steam. A thin gray thread rising from a crack in the snow-covered rock, so faint she had almost mistaken it for her own breath. She remembered how her husband had knelt beside her in the ravine, following the tracks of some animal that had clearly known the warmth was there long before they had, brushing frost from his eyelashes as he studied the narrow opening in the hillside. Neither of them could have known, in that frozen, uncertain moment, what lay beyond that crack of stone, nor what it would come to mean. "You've gone quiet," her husband said now, appearing at her elbow with an armful of firewood, snow still melting in his hair. His eyes followed hers to the steaming water, and something soft passed between them, unspoken but understood. "I was thinking of the ravine," she said. "The night we had nothing." He set the wood down slowly, steam rising all around them, and did not look away from her face. She did not answer him directly. Instead, her mind slipped backward, the way it so often did when the wind picked up outside the cave mouth and rattled the pines, carrying her to that first bitter arrival at Silver Creek 2 years past. They had come down from the eastern trail with their wagon groaning under the weight of what little they owned, a trunk of linens, a plow blade wrapped in oilcloth, a few sacks of seed corn they had hoped to plant come spring. The settlement had seemed a modest promise then, a scatter of log buildings hunched along the creek, smoke curling from chimneys, the mercantile's lantern glowing gold against the gathering dusk. They had arranged, weeks before, through a letter carried by a passing freighter, to rent a small cabin at the edge of town from a widower who had moved on to Cheyenne. It was to be theirs through the winter, a roof and 4 walls while they searched out land of their own come thaw. But the man who greeted them at the mercantile counter had only shaken his head slowly, wiping his hands on his apron as though the gesture might soften what he had to say. The claim on that parcel, he told them, had come into dispute. A cousin of the widower had ridden in from Laramie with papers of his own, insisting the land and the cabin upon it belonged to him by an older filing. The matter would sit before the land office for weeks, maybe months, and no one, the man said, not even out of kindness, dared let strangers move into a house that might not be theirs to offer. She remembered the cold settling into her chest at those words, heavier than the weather. Isaac had said little, only thanked the man, and led her back out into the graying afternoon, his jaw set in that quiet way he had when trouble came, and there was no use cursing it. They had stood together at the edge of the street, watching the first flakes drift down soft and unhurried, deceiving in their gentleness, while the mountains behind the town had already gone the color of iron. By nightfall, the snow had thickened into something with purpose, falling in earnest sheets that swallowed the wagon ruts behind them and turned the pines to pale ghosts. They had made camp under canvas stretched between two trees, huddled close for warmth that never quite came, listening to the wind test the edges of their shelter as though it meant to peel it away entirely. She remembered lying awake beside him, counting his breaths in the dark, wondering with a fear she did not speak aloud whether they had come west only to freeze before they had truly begun. It was in the gray hush of the following morning, stiff and hollow-eyed, that they had risen and gone looking, not for a home yet, only for tracks in the snow that might lead somewhere warmer than where they stood. The bench he had built that second autumn still held the scent of raw pine beneath the layer of wood smoke it had gathered since, and he ran his palm along its edge now, testing the joints the way he always did before the cold months set in, checking that nothing had loosened in the damp warmth that never quite left the chamber. Steam curled up from the pool nearby, thick as breath on a winter morning, and beyond the wooden partition he had framed for modesty's sake, a traveler was humming low and contented, working the last of the trail's stiffness from his shoulders in water that never froze. "Man could stay here forever," the traveler called out, not expecting an answer, so much as needing to say it aloud, the way men did when relief loosened their tongues. "Never felt anything like it. Feels like the mountains holding you instead of trying to kill you." Isaac only nodded, though the man couldn't see him through the boards, and went on stacking the folded blankets on the shelf he'd carved into the stone for that purpose. He said nothing of how strange it was to hear warmth spoken of so easily now, as an amenity, a comfort worth a few coins and a sack of flour, when there had been a night, not so long past that he'd forgotten its shape, when warmth had been the only thing in the world worth having and nowhere to be found. He thought of that first night often, though he rarely spoke of it, the way a man doesn't speak of a wound long healed but still feels in the weather, the canvas snapping like something alive above them, her shoulder pressed to his ribs, both of them pretending sleep for the other's sake. He remembered the particular kind of cold that had settled into his hands that night, a cold that seemed to reach past skin and bone into something more essential, until he'd begun to wonder, in the grim arithmetic a man does when he's frightened and won't admit it, how many hours they truly had left before the cold simply became too patient to fight. He had not told her, not then and not since, how close he had come that morning to believing they'd made a mistake in coming west at all, that the land which had promised them a claim and a cabin and a future had instead handed them nothing but snow and the slow understanding that promises meant little against weather. He had kept walking only because stopping felt like agreeing with that thought, and he could not bear to agree with it in front of her. The traveler's voice rose again from behind the boards, cheerful, oblivious, asking whether there might be coffee to be had once he'd finished. Isaac answered that there was, and turned toward the kitchen end of the cavern, where the sound of a spoon against tin told him she was already pouring it, steam rising there too, mingling with the steam from the pool, as though the whole cave breathed as one living thing around them. The steam curling from the tin cup seemed, for a moment, to carry her backward, the way a scent or a sound sometimes does when the mind is not watching for it. She set the pot down on the warm stone shelf and let her eyes drift toward the low arch of rock above the pool, and she was there again, 2 winters gone, in the hour before dusk, when the light had turned the color of ash and the wind had stopped pretending to be gentle. They had been walking since midday, following a set of deer tracks that wandered without purpose through the ravine, crossed now and again by the smaller, quicker prints of a fox, all of it stitched into snow that had stopped being soft hours before and had begun to squeal under their boots with each step, a high, thin sound that seemed to mock how little progress they were making. The trees on either slope had grown black against the failing sky, and the cold had stopped feeling like weather and had become instead a kind of company, walking beside them, patient and unhurried, certain of how the day would end if they did not find shelter soon. She remembered how quiet they had grown, not from anger or despair, but from the plain fact that speech cost breath, and breath had become too precious a thing to spend on words that would not build a fire or find a roof. Isaac's hand had found hers once, briefly, through the wool of her glove, and she had understood it as everything he could not say, that he was afraid, that he would not show it, that he needed her to keep walking so that he might have a reason to keep walking too. It was the tracks that saved them, though not in the way either of them expected. The deer had cut sharply toward the base of the ravine wall, toward a fold of rock that seemed, at first glance, no different from any other shadowed crease in that white and gray country. She had almost passed it by. But something in the air there was wrong in a way that caught at the edge of her attention before her mind had named it. A faint softness to the light just above the rock, a blurring, as though the cold itself had thinned. She stopped. Isaac stopped beside her, following her gaze without yet understanding it. And there, rising from a crevice no wider than a barrel stave, was a thread of steam, pale and slow, curling upward into the darkening sky and vanishing before it had gone more than a few feet, small, easy to miss, easy to mistake for nothing at all. She had stared at it the way a person stares at a thing they are afraid to hope about, afraid that looking too hard might make it disappear. The stew pot sat heavy on its iron hook, steam rising from it in the same slow, curling way that other steam had risen from the rock 2 winters before, and she found herself smiling at the strangeness of it, how a thing could echo itself across years without meaning to. The young couple across the stone counter watched her ladle the broth into wooden bowls, their cheeks still red from the cold trail, their eyes drifting again and again toward the glow of the pool beyond the changing room, as though they could not quite believe such warmth existed inside a mountain. "How did you ever find it?" the young woman asked, wrapping both hands around her bowl. "Truly, did you know it was here?" She shook her head, setting the ladle down, letting herself sink for a moment into the memory rather than around it. "We didn't know anything," she said. "We were following deer tracks because we had nowhere else to go, and no better idea. We saw steam coming out of a crack in the rock no wider than a barrel stave. I thought I was imagining it. I stood there afraid to blink, afraid it might vanish if I looked away." The husband, a lean young man with a rope-burned hand wrapped in cloth, leaned forward. "And you just went in?" "We didn't know what we'd find," she admitted. "Could have been nothing. Could have been a den. Could have been a drop straight down into the dark. But it was that or freeze in a cabin that wasn't even ours anymore, so we squeezed through the opening sideways, shoulder first, and I remember holding my breath the whole way, certain the rock would close up around me like a mouth." She paused, remembering the exact feel of it, the cold stone scraping her coat, the sudden absence of wind, the way sound had changed the instant she was inside, gone soft and close. And it was warm, she said. Warmer than any room I'd stood in since autumn. Dry, too, which we hadn't dared hope for. There was a pool of clear water steaming right there in the dark, and stone shelves like something had shaped them on purpose, though nothing had. I stood there and cried, before I even understood why. The young woman's eyes had gone bright, caught somewhere between disbelief and longing. You must have thought you'd found a miracle. I thought I'd found a place to survive the night, she said gently. The miracle came later, once we understood it wasn't going anywhere, that it would still be warm in the morning, and the morning after that. She refilled their bowls without being asked, waving off the young man's offer of a coin. Outside, the wind pressed against the wooden door Isaac had built years before, and somewhere deeper in the cave, water moved quietly over stone, patient and constant, the same low sound it had made the very first night, when neither of them had known yet what they'd stumbled into, or how long it would go on giving. The young woman lingered by the fire a moment longer, as if she might ask another question, then rose to gather her husband's things, and the moment passed the way moments did in that place, quietly, without ceremony, leaving only the sound of water behind it. She sat back down near the warmth of the near pool, and for a while she let herself drift, the way the steam drifted, back to that first night when the cave had been nothing but darkness and dripping stone and the ragged sound of two people breathing too hard from cold and fear. She remembered how the light from their single lantern had caught the water first, not a shimmer, but a kind of breathing glow, as though the pool itself were alive with warmth it had no business holding in the dead of a mountain winter. She remembered reaching a bare hand toward it, certain she was imagining the heat, and then gasping when her fingers met water soft as bath water drawn fresh from a stove. Isaac had knelt beside her without a word, testing it himself, his face unreadable in the lantern light, though she had heard the breath go out of him all the same. The stone shelves had seemed almost impossible in their neatness. Flat surfaces layered one above another along the near wall, dry as a cellar floor despite the damp air rising off the pool a few feet away. She had run her hand along one, half expecting to find tool marks, some sign that hands before theirs had shaped it, but there had been nothing, only the smooth patience of water and time working slower than any human hand could work. The wind, when she'd turned to listen for it, had gone strangely distant, muffled by rock and by the narrow twist of the passage they'd crawled through, until it seemed less like a storm and more like a memory of one, howling somewhere far above them instead of pressing at their backs. She remembered looking at Isaac then, and him looking back at her, both of them still dripping snowmelt onto stone that did not seem to mind, and neither of them speaking for a long moment because there had been nothing sensible to say. They had lost the cabin. They had no roof, no claim, no coin to spare for either. And yet here was warmth rising out of the mountain itself, asking nothing of them but that they stay and receive it. It was Isaac who had finally broken the silence, his voice rough with cold and disbelief. "We could winter here," he'd said, not as a question, but as a man testing whether the words could bear their own weight once spoken aloud. She had only nodded, unable yet to trust her voice, and reached for his hand in the dark, the two of them standing together at the edge of that steaming water, deciding without further argument that this strange, hidden place, however it had come to be, would be theirs. Now, 2 winters gone, he crouched at the edge of that same timber floor and pressed his palm flat against it, the way a man might test the flank of a good horse, checking for soundness before a long ride. The boards had darkened with years of steam and wood smoke, but they held firm beneath his weight, not a single one loosened by frost or damp, though the mountain had breathed its warm, wet breath across them every day since he'd laid them down. "Still true," he said, more to himself than to her, though she stood close enough to hear, wrapped in a shawl she no longer needed indoors but wore from habit. He remembered the hauling of it, the sledges of split lumber dragged behind their one weary mule up through drifts that came to his thigh, the way his shoulders had burned by the 4th trip and screamed by the 8th. He had cursed under his breath more than once that first autumn, not at the mountain, never at her, but at his own hands for being too slow, too raw, too unused yet to the particular ache of building something from nothing. Stone had been worse in some ways, colder to carry, heavier to set, unforgiving of a poor fit. He had spent whole afternoons shaping a single ledge to sit right beside the pool, only to find it wrong by a thumb's width and start again. And all the while, word had traveled down into Silver Creek the way word always did, faster than any wagon could carry it. He had heard it himself once, standing outside the mercantile with his collar up against the wind, a rancher's laugh, easy and unkind, saying something about a fool and his wife holed up like badgers in a steaming ditch, waiting to be boiled alive or buried by spring. He hadn't answered it then. There had seemed no use in arguing with men who had never crawled through a snow-choked passage and felt warmth close around them like a held breath. They laughed, he said now, straightening, right up until the day they didn't. She came and sat on the sleeping platform he'd built, its frame still square, its ropes still taut beneath the tick mattress, and patted the space beside her, without needing to ask him twice. He sat, and for a moment neither of them spoke, listening instead to the low murmur of the spring beyond the stone partition, steady as it had always been, indifferent to laughter or doubt, or the passing of 2 winters. "I used to lie right here," he said, "too tired to feel my hands, wondering if I'd made a fool's bargain. And now?" He looked toward the doorway he'd framed with his own 2 hands, toward the faint gray light of falling snow beyond it, and toward the low hum of voices already gathering near the outer pool where travelers waited their turn at warmth. "Now I wonder how any of them ever thought a house needed 4 walls of lumber and nothing more." She had smiled at that, though the smile carried the particular weight of memory rather than agreement, and she let her eyes drift toward the stone shelf she had built along the near wall of the kitchen alcove, its surface worn smooth now from 2 years of use, but still bearing, if one looked close, the marks of her first uncertain chisel strokes. That first winter she had worked by lamplight and by the pale glow that came off the pool itself, stacking flat river stones one against another, mortaring them with clay she'd dug and dried near the entrance, learning by failure which angles held and which crumbled at the first thaw of morning. She remembered the ache in her shoulders those weeks, an ache different from any she'd known breaking sod or hauling water, born of patience rather than exertion, of trying again what had fallen the day before. She had not believed, not truly, that the spring would hold its warmth clean through the worst of it, not until the deepest cold came in January and she woke one morning expecting to find the pool crusted at its edges the way the creek had been outside, and found instead the same clear steaming surface it always wore, untouched by frost, giving off its faint mineral breath into air so cold it had turned the moisture on the cave walls to a fine glittering rime everywhere the warmth did not reach. She had knelt there a long while that morning, hands cupped in the water, simply watching her own breath disappear into the steam rising around her, and had understood then that they had not merely found shelter, but something stranger and more faithful than shelter, a thing that would not fail them no matter how deep the snow grew outside. It was that same certainty that had made her try the herbs, small cuttings of mint and sage she'd carried, wrapped in damp cloth from the last garden she'd ever have above ground, tucking them into shallow beds of gravel near the warmest stones, where the steam curled thickest. Others in Silver Creek would have called it foolishness twice over, planting green things in a cave in the dead of winter, and perhaps it was foolish, but she had wanted some proof, however small, that a person could grow something living in a place the whole town had already decided was fit only for dying quietly and being forgotten. When the first pale shoots pushed up through the gravel in February, she had said nothing to anyone in town, only clipped a few leaves into the broth she made that night, and let the taste answer the question she hadn't asked aloud. She told him some of this now, watching the fire's reflection move across the spring's black surface, and he listened the way he always had, as though her small victories were no smaller than his own timber and nails, and outside the framed doorway, the snow kept falling steady and silent over a valley that had once mocked them and now, in its own slow way, had begun to listen too. The last of the evening's travelers, a freight hauler and his tired mule, had gone on toward the stage road an hour before, leaving only the sound of dripping stone and the low murmur of water finding its own level in the dark. She led him by the hand to the second pool, the larger one, where the old stone wall still stood half in shadow, and they sat together on the bench he had built along its edge, close enough that their shoulders touched, close enough to feel the heat rising off the water like a living thing. "Do you remember," she said, "the first ones who came?" He did. He would always remember it, the way a person remembers weather that nearly killed them. It had been deep into their second winter, the wind driving sideways across the ridge, when the knock had come at the wooden door he'd hung himself, 3 raw knuckles against timber, so soft at first he'd thought it was only ice shifting. He had opened it to find 2 men half frozen, their beards crusted white, leading a third who could no longer stand on his own, all 3 of them staring past him at the steam curling up from the spring as though they'd stumbled into a dream they didn't trust. "They thought we were mad," she said, smiling into the water's surface, "living in a hole in the mountain. They stopped thinking that quick enough," he said, "once they got their boots off." She laughed, a soft sound that echoed faintly against the stone. She remembered how she had not hesitated, how something in her had simply known what to do. Broth on the fire, blankets from the sleeping platform, room made at the warmest shelf without a single question asked of men who looked too far gone to answer. It was only after, when their color had returned and their voices had steadied, that one of them had pressed a small sack of cornmeal into her hands, insisting, ashamed, to take shelter for nothing. She had refused it twice before she understood that letting him give it was its own kind of mercy. "That was the start of it," Isaac said quietly, "before we ever meant it to be. We didn't build this place to be an inn," she said. "No," he agreed. "We built it to keep from freezing. The rest just found us." Outside, the wind pressed faintly against the mountain, and somewhere down the passage a bench creaked where no one sat. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching steam rise and vanish above the black water, thinking of that first ragged knock, of how close it had come to going unanswered, and how much had grown, quietly, from the moment she chose to open the door, instead of fearing what the cold had sent to it. The memory carried her further back than the knock at the door, past even that first winter's hardest nights, to a gray afternoon in early spring, when the snow had softened enough for exploring. She had gone with a lantern past the sleeping platform, past the kitchen shelf where dried herbs hung in bundles, following a draft she'd felt for weeks along the cavern's rear wall, a thread of air too steady to be nothing. He had followed her with the axe, more out of habit than worry, and together they had found the crack widened by some old fall of stone, just large enough to turn sideways through. The second chamber had opened around them like a held breath finally released. It was larger than the first, the ceiling rising higher into shadow the lantern couldn't reach, and the pool at its center wider and darker, steam curling off it in slow ribbons that caught the light and scattered it gold. The warmth here was deeper, older somehow, though she could not have said why she felt that. It was the wall that stopped them both cold. Stones stacked with purpose, mortared with something dried and pale, forming a barrier chest-high along one edge of the chamber. Not a natural formation, not a trick of collapsed rock, but the plain work of hands, old hands. The mortar had crumbled at its edges, and moss she didn't recognize grew faint and silver in the cracks. Someone was here, she had whispered, though there was no one to overhear. He had run his palm along the top stone, slow, almost reverent. Long before us. Neither of them had felt afraid, not the way the stories back in town might have suggested they should. There was no menace in the stillness, no chill beyond the ordinary chill of stone. Instead, she had felt something closer to kinship, the quiet understanding that others, in some forgotten winter of their own, had found this same warmth and known enough to be grateful for it. They had stood a long while in the lantern light, tracing the wall's length, wondering what hands had built it and why, wondering how long the mountain had been keeping this secret before it offered it up to them the way it had, through steam rising into a snow-covered ravine, through animal tracks they'd nearly walked past. It wasn't luck, she had said finally, was it, finding this place? He hadn't answered right away. He'd only looked at the wall, and then at her, lantern light warm across both their faces, and said the thing she still carried with her 2 winters later, sitting beside the very fire that wall's chamber would come to warm. Maybe some places wait, he'd said, for someone who needs them enough to look. The passage behind the wall had revealed itself slowly, the way most gifts of that mountain seemed to, not all at once, but in pieces, as if the stone wanted to be sure of them before giving up its last secret. It had taken 3 days of careful work, prying loose stones that had sat undisturbed for who could say how many decades, before the narrow gap widened enough for a person to pass through sideways, lantern held ahead like an offering. What lay beyond had taken both their breaths. Not another chamber, but a corridor of rock sloping gently downward, cool at first, then warming again as it opened onto a sheltered valley she hadn't known existed on that side of the ridge, a fold in the mountain's shoulder, protected from the worst of the wind, with a clear line of sight toward the distant thread of the stage road. He had stood at the mouth of it a long while, snow blowing sideways just beyond the rock overhang, and said what she'd already begun to understand herself. It wasn't only a curiosity. It was a road, a safer one, cut through the mountain's own body, sparing travelers the exposed switchbacks that claimed wagons and nearly claimed lives most winters. They had told no one at first, uncertain what to make of it, uncertain, too, whether such a thing ought to belong to anyone. But word of the cave had already spread beyond their choosing, and it hadn't taken long before a freight driver, half frozen and grateful, had asked what lay behind the wooden door at the back of the bathing chamber, and Isaac had shown him, and the driver had wept a little, unashamed, at the sight of open sky where he'd expected only stone. By the second winter, the passage had become as known as the pool itself. Drivers spoke of it at the mercantile, at the stage office, in the pews on Sunday, not as a curiosity anymore, but as a mercy. Men who had once laughed about a steaming hole in the mountain now marked their winter routes by it, timed their travel by when Mabel's kitchen would have something hot waiting, when Isaac's benches would be dry and warm beside the larger pool. She had watched the mountain give up its last hidden thing and thought of what he'd said in the lantern light, that some places waited for someone who needed them enough to look. She wondered now if the reverse were also true, if a place, once found, might go on giving to whoever came after, the way it had given to them. Snow gathered outside the cave's mouth, even now, 2 winters deep into their strange, warm life, and somewhere beyond it, she knew, a traveler was making his way toward the light leaking from the stone. She set down the ladle she'd been turning over in her hands and went to stand in the mouth of the cave, where the wooden door frame he'd built 2 winters ago now hung wide to let the evening air move through. He followed her, wiping his palms on his trousers, and together they watched the snow come down in the last gray light, thick and unhurried, the way it had fallen that first terrible afternoon when they'd had nothing but a wagon, a few crates, and each other. Inside, behind them, the sounds of the rest stop settled into their evening rhythm, travelers murmuring by the larger pool, a kettle ticking on the stone shelf, someone's low laughter carrying warm off the water. It was a good sound, she thought. A living sound. The cave that had once been mocked from one end of Silver Creek to the other now held more warmth in an evening than most houses held in a week, and none of it, not one particle of steam or stone, had come to them by anything but stubbornness and grace. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, the way she had that first night, when the wind had screamed outside and the spring had steamed on undisturbed, indifferent to their fear, patient as it had always been. She thought of the stone wall they'd found, of the narrow passage now worn smooth by boots that were not their own, of how a place could be discovered twice, once by desperate people with nowhere else to go, and once by a mountain deciding, in its slow and ancient way, to be generous again. "They laughed at us," she said, not bitterly, just remembering. "They did," he agreed. "Some of them are asleep in there right now." She smiled at that, and he smiled too, and for a moment they simply watched the snow fall past the doorway, silvering the ravine, filling in the tracks they had followed that first day, toward a thread of steam that had looked, at the time, like nothing at all. "It never stopped being ours," she said quietly, "even with all of them inside it now." "No," he said, "it never did." He drew the door partly closed against the cold, though not all the way, because there was still light to watch by, still snow to see falling soft and endless over the ridge that had once seemed only an obstacle and had become, instead, a home. The warmth of the spring moved gently through the stone at their backs, steady as it had always been, steady as the 2 of them standing together in its glow. Whatever the mountain had once refused to give the world, it had given to them first, and they would carry that quiet knowledge, of steam in the snow, of a door built by his hands and a kitchen built by hers, for as long as they lived beside its warmth, together.